Have you heard of the rat park experiment?
No, I haven't.
Yeah. So it was this study when they were studying drugs and addiction. I forget what decade it was, maybe like 30 years ago or something. And they looked at the effect of, I think it was morphine laced water. And so they put they put morphine in water and gave it to rats in cages. And these rats would sit there and drink the morphine water until they died. So they really showed how addictive it was, right? But then this one researcher had this question. He said, well, they're in these horrible cages. It's not really a nice environment. Like, what if we gave them a happy environment to live in, where they had running wheels and other rats to play with, and it was actually a nicer place to live? And when they did that, they found that the rats barely touched the morphine water, that they would drink a little bit, but then they would go play and have sex and run on the wheels. And what it really illustrates is that addiction is never really about the substance. It's about what's going on in your life that's causing you to reach out for distraction or, wanting to escape.
Hello and welcome to Nourish. My name is Kasha and I'm a holistic life coach and second-year doctoral student studying acupuncture and traditional Chinese medicine. My mission with this podcast is to share the stories of inspiring humans who have discovered that elusive state of balance between striving for success and having that sense of interconnectedness and spirituality. Think yin and yang in flow. Now, as a former Silicon Valley burnout escapee myself, teaser, I left the tech world after 11 years of a successful career in product management. I know firsthand how difficult it can be to integrate the two. This podcast shares the stories I wish I had heard when I was struggling to find that balance and flow myself. My hope is that these interviews inspire you and give you the tools to rethink your own approach to mental, physical, and spiritual well-being. And if you are struggling, help you find your way back to authentic alignment. Now sit back, relax, and ground yourself back home, and let's get started. Hello, and welcome back to Nourish. Today's conversation is filled with incredible wisdom, y'all. We are going to cover a topic that I believe is so relevant in today's day and age, and that is addiction. Now, when we think of addiction, traditionally we think about alcohol, drugs, maybe gambling, but y'all, we are living in a world that is literally wired for addiction. Everything from the media we consume to the social isolation that we have experienced over the last few years, these are all contributing factors to addiction and addictive behaviors. We will absolutely be getting into all of this, unpacking the science, psychology, and emotional aspects of addiction. But before we do, let's welcome my next guest who will be covering it with me, Jeremy Lipkowitz. Jeremy is a mindfulness and emotional intelligence facilitator and certified porn addiction recovery coach for men. Jeremy overcame his own addiction to pornography in his early 20s with the help of mindfulness meditation and Buddhist philosophy, which not only helped him let go of his destructive behaviors, but allowed him to connect with deeper meaning and purpose in his life. For the past 11 years, Jeremy has been teaching mindfulness and emotional intelligence practices at universities, recovery centers, and companies throughout Europe, Asia, and the US. He has been featured in places like Men's Health and Livestrong magazine for his work in helping people overcome compulsive behaviors and addictions. Jeremy holds a bachelor's and master's degree in genetics and genomics and spent several years at Duke University working towards a PhD in genetics and systems biology before he turned full-time to teaching and coaching. And one more fun fact, Jeremy also spent time in Asia as a monk. So we will definitely save that for part 2. But we covered so much on today's episode. Jeremy's journey from addiction to recovery, the science and psychology behind addiction, recognizing supportive shame from detrimental shame, the power of mindfulness, and Jeremy's journey with Buddhism, neuroplasticity and the science of rewiring your brain, defining happiness, and cultivating your life in support of that, and so much more. Enjoyed this episode as much as I enjoyed recording it, and without further ado, let's jump on into it. Jeremy, welcome to the Nourish podcast.
Hello, I'm so excited to be here and looking forward to diving into some of these topics.
Oh, yes. Likewise, I really was like giddy with excitement, as I told you right before I jumped on this call. I think these topics are super, super juicy. But before we dive into any of them, I want to kick it off with a question that I ask each and every guest, which is, what are 3 words that you would use to describe yourself?
Yeah, so I had prepared my 3 words, and I think one of them I'm going to have to change. So the first one I'll say is curious. I'm a very curious person by nature. And the second one I'll say is understanding, and that relates to some of what we'll talk about later. But I generally feel like I understand where people are coming from, why they do the things they do, and so there's a lack of judgment there. And the third one I was going to say motivated, but I think it's probably more competitive. I think that's my competitive nature that comes out. So those are the 3 I would say.
I love that. And thank you for sharing those. They seem very balanced, I will say, like in kind of receiving them. So I love that.
Maybe balanced is actually a better word to describe me. I do think that resonates.
Okay, we could do 4. I like it. All right. Now, with that kind of setting the foundation for the type of human you are, which that's why I love that. I love that question because it really does give people an insight as to like who's on the other side of the mic. Let's dive into this. You are a mindfulness and emotional intelligence facilitator and a certified porn addiction recovery coach for men.
Mm-hmm.
You overcame your own addiction to pornography in your early 20s with the help of mindfulness meditation and Buddhist philosophy. And this was very transformative for you from what you shared with me and what I read online. And it really helped you connect with deeper meaning and purpose in your life. Now, your story is very inspiring because you're touching on a topic that really has just so much taboo associated with it. And, you know, warranted or not, there's a lot of shame associated with the topic of addiction, the topic of porn addiction. And I know that this has created a real foundation for your career and the work that you do. But I'm going to assume it wasn't always the case that this was something that you would so willingly just, you know, come and talk about. So I want to start at the very beginning and kind of define this for people. What exactly is a porn addiction? Because there's like such a blurred line, even when I was looking at defining it. Like, how do you know that you have an addiction, let's say, to porn?
Yeah, it's such a great question and a great one to begin with because it is really a spectrum and there's no definite answer. There's no easy way to define it. And so looking at some of the definitions of addiction, you know, one way of looking at it is repeated use of some substance or behavior despite negative consequences. And so that's a great way to look at any sort of addiction. Is it something that you continually do, maybe in a compulsive way or where you feel emotionally dependent on it, but to the point where it's interfering with your daily life or your relationships or your ability to function? And so I really like that definition because it makes it open to interpretation. You know, people have to look within themselves and say, what are the ways that this is affecting my life? What are the ways it's benefiting my life? And what are the ways that it's harming my life? And it's only when you look at it holistically like that, that you can start to say, oh, this is actually having negative consequences that outweigh the benefits that it's bringing to my life. So with porn addiction, you know, you could apply that to any substance or behavior, but with porn, it's really looking at the question of, is the way that I'm engaging with porn causing harm in my life? You know, is it interfering with my relationships, my ability to work or function? So that's really one way of looking at it.
I think that's such a good definition. And it immediately brings to mind, you know, I think about other substances as well, like alcohol, drugs, digital media. And it's so interesting to use that term or I guess to define it as it's starting to, this behavior or this kind of consumption is starting to negatively affect my life, because where is the line, right? Like, let's just even use alcohol as an example. I do drink alcohol and I don't feel so great afterwards, especially depending on the kind of alcohol that I have. And, you know, in my past life, I was in a relationship with somebody who had suffered from substance abuse. And I remember that it was like really difficult to identify, like, where is this really causing harm in your life. And so is there even a way to like look into that further, or is it truly really subjective, right? I'd love to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's such a good topic and it opens up so many doors. And one of the problems is that a lot of the consequences of some of these behaviors are very hard to link together. So for example, with porn addiction, some of the negative effects are hard to recognize that they're coming from watching porn. They're things that are far downstream or they're so subtle, but when you add them up over years and years of use, that's when they start to impact you. So for many people, they're not even aware of the consequences of some of their behaviors. And it really is this ripple effect, like whether you take drinking or porn or any other addictive behavior, it affects so many different areas of your life that you can't really take a full inventory. You can't really say, this is the full calculation. These are all the pros and these are all the cons. At some point, you really have to look and use your intuition and say, okay, I really understand that this is impacting my life negatively. And you start to develop more of an awareness of where it's impacting your life, but it's not easy.
So I'm so curious because I think denial has been known to be like a key part of, as though it can't get any more difficult, right? Like once you're experiencing addiction, it's hard to recognize that you're kind of in this situation. How did you find yourself in this situation? Like, let's go back to, as you reflect on your journey, what was that path like for you?
First, I'll start, with just how I got introduced to pornography. And one of the things I really like to emphasize is that I am not anti-pornography. I think there are conversations to be had about the connection between the porn industry and sex trafficking and the treatment of women. And there's a lot of nuanced discussions there. But on a principle level, I'm not inherently opposed to viewing images of people having sex on a screen. And I think that's important because we can normalize the desire to look at porn. And for every, young person, when you're growing up and you start experiencing these sexual feelings, it's natural to want to look at pornographic images. And so for me, it started at a young age, maybe 8 or 9 years old, looking at certain comic book characters that I was attracted to, and maybe the lingerie catalog that would come in the mail. Eventually started going online and downloading pictures and videos. And what's interesting is because it started at such a young age and it just slowly developed over time, I never realized that it was something that was captivating me to the degree that it was, because it was something that had been there my whole life. It was just something I did. And I didn't recognize how bad it was until I was in my 20s already and had some of these moments of recognizing what it was doing to my life. But in many ways, it was something that comforted me as a young boy, dealing with emotional issues, wanting to run away from all kinds of things that we deal with as kids, the trauma of being a young person and growing up and dealing with all the stuff that happens. You find your ways of coping with it, whether it's drugs or behaviors, pornography, TV, different ways that we act out and behave. And so for me, pornography was one of the main coping mechanisms I had for making myself feel better. And it got to the point when I was in college, I think I was watching at least 1.5, 2 hours every night. I would go into my room, lock my door, and then, dive into the world of internet pornography, which by the time I got to college, it was this vast world of, unending novelty and variety, and anything you wanted, you could search for and find. And so you could really spend hours and hours just looking for new stuff. So by the time I got to college, I was looking at a couple hours every night. And on some bad days, it would be maybe a few hours in a row. Other days, not so much. But that was really how I found myself in it.
Wow. It's like crazy to hear you describe this, because I almost feel like I'm experiencing like a parallel universe here where you're talking about your journey and the hours that were spent kind of disconnected from, in a way, like everything that's going on. And then I think about the hours that, I see recorded on my phone, just like being on my phone, swiping. And it's really interesting. I'm curious in your kind of experience now going through this, working with people who are currently experiencing this or going through this. Is there a difference between porn addiction and other kinds of addictions. I don't know if it's like from the scientific point of view in
Mm-hmm.
terms of what's happening within the brain. I think I was also thinking like there can also be a lot of shame. There's like this
Mm-hmm.
forbidden fruit aspect to experiencing like human pleasure and whatnot. So I'm curious, like, do you think that also plays a factor into the addiction based on what you know now?
100%. There are ways in which porn addiction is similar to other addictions, and there are many ways in which it's unique. The one of the things that you brought up, shame, is so important because for some reason, sexuality is shameful in a way that many other addictions aren't. There's something about being a sex addict or a porn addict that feels more shameful than other things for some reason. And I don't necessarily know why. There's probably some reasons behind this. But it's a thing that we see often is people feel very much ashamed of their sexuality. It's something about feeling like a pervert, feeling like, you're gross in some way. But shame plays a huge role in porn addiction and really exacerbates the addiction. Because when it's something that you feel ashamed of, you tend to isolate. So shame exacerbates these addictions because you don't feel able to go out and get the support that you need. You can't open up about it. You can't tell your friends or therapists or family members because you're so ashamed of it. So that's one of the ways where it's quite unique. Not to say that other addictions aren't, people don't feel shame around it, but there is something about sexual addictions that feel particularly shameful. I would also say that in the ways that it's similar, almost all these addictions work on the dopamine signaling pathways in the brain. And so whether it's you're addicted to social media or, particularly these behavioral addictions, so things like gambling, shopping, video games, pornography, they work on that dopamine network. And it's true for other drugs and substances as well, where we get that hit of dopamine when we're engaged in searching for our substance or the behavior. So in many ways, they act on the same neurological level. It's so crazy to me that people think that something can't be an addiction if it's not a substance. Like, porn addiction isn't real because it's not a substance. It is a substance. You're consuming it through your eyes, and it's working on the same neurological circuits that every other addictive substance is working on. It's just a different method of consuming the substance. And so we know now that these things can be an addiction, and gambling can be an addiction, shopping can be an addiction, pornography can be an addiction. It's really just about how does it play out in your life. The one other thing I'll say about the uniqueness of porn, there's one thing that I read once. It's called the 3 A's of porn addiction. And it's one of the things that makes porn so highly addictive are these 3 A's. And the first is what's known as the accessibility of porn. So, porn is everywhere accessible, right? Every kid has a cell phone, a smartphone where they can access all the different porn sites they want. So it's easy to access. It's highly affordable. So that's the second A. For the most part, it's free. And there are ways where it can actually cost money, but you can have an infinite variety of porn that is accessible and affordable. You can get it for free. And then the third A is that it's anonymous. Nobody has to know that you're doing it. It's easy to hide. There's so many people struggling with porn addiction that nobody knows because you can be very highly functioning. You can't smell it. You can't really see it. It's not like you can see needles in veins or anything like that. So those are sometimes called the perfect storm of porn addiction, is those 3 A's.
So I'm curious, kind of speaking to these 3 A's, which is like a slight tangent from the whole list of questions that I have right now, but totally related. You mentioned accessibility, affordability, and the anonymous aspect. And I think that, especially the anonymous aspect, it almost sounds like this kind of dangerous loop because you're anonymous, but like, what's going on. So there's like this kind of hiding from this whole experience or not wanting to be seen in that way, which perpetuates the shame, I assume. But I'm curious about accessibility and affordability because I know that there's a lot of discussion around things like, limiting technology for kids or limiting accessibility to things like drugs or legalizing all drugs to make them kind of less, I guess, compelling. You kind of remove a certain level of like that forbidden fruit aspect. But then at the same time, when you're describing these 3 A's, I almost feel like, oh, wow, could it play in the opposite direction? And, what are your thoughts on that, right? Like, because there is something to be said for obviously removing a lot of stigma once things like certain substances are legal and whatnot. But then there's also the other aspect, which is like, if it's more accessible, more affordable, does that kind of perpetuate addictive behaviors? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it is a little bit of a conundrum because that forbidden fruit thing is real. If something is forbidden, if we say, oh, we can't talk about it or it's shameful, it makes people more excited and more interested in it. I think there's a huge parallel with what we've seen kind of the drug addiction space with things like safe injection sites, which we know are so helpful that if people are going to be injecting heroin, whatever, to give them a safe space to do it, where they have clean needles, they have support. If they overdose, they can get resuscitated. And you actually, rather than pushing it underground where it's going to happen anyway, you say, listen, we know this is going to happen. We want to give you a safe place to do it so that, if you are in serious trouble, we can actually help you and all that stuff. The flip side of that is that we know that, the exposure to addictive substances increases your likelihood of getting addicted to it. If you live on a deserted island, there's no drugs, there's no anything, you're not going to get addicted to it, right? Just because the exposure isn't there. But if you live in a community where everyone is injecting, everyone is using a certain drug, you're much more likely, even if you are not an addictive personality type of person, even if you're not necessarily prone or anything to it, you're more likely to become addicted just because of the exposure of constantly being around it. And so the fact that kids have, and a big topic is what's going on with our kids, right? Because that's the next generation. But for adults as well, you can get it anywhere you want. We see more and more sexualization in the social media that we're looking at. I mean, Instagram, TikTok can be huge sources of softcore pornography for a lot of young men and women, and all the different things that come out of that, right? So it's a difficult question because we don't want to ban it or outlaw it, because then again, it makes it, this forbidden fruit. But just recognizing that the accessibility of it and the affordability does lead it to being a more addictive substance.
There was a study, and I believe it came out of Portugal. I'm going to definitely find it and link it in the show notes to make sure I got it. I have all the accurate information, but it was about the topic of, I think it was in a book about loneliness and addiction, which I also will link. But the author talks about how it wasn't just the decriminalization of drugs, but also removing the stigma and the shame associated with being an addict that really helped increase the rates at which addicts were able to overcome their addictions and stay clean. What are your thoughts in terms of the levers that are most important to kind of activate when it comes to helping people who are suffering from addiction overcome addiction? And I'd also love to hear your own experience on getting through this personally.
Yeah, so I think you're probably talking about Johann Hari and kind of that.
Yes, you got it. Yeah. Such a good book. I'm linking it. It's such a good book. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and it's shame. A lot of the work that I do I particularly work with men, and this is something we can get into. Women also suffer from porn addiction. It's a little bit lower the rates. Men are a bit more prone to it. But I particularly work with men. And one of the most important things that I do with men is helping them let go of the shame. The shame that makes them feel like they're the only one, that makes them feel like they're broken, that they're unlovable, and really letting go of that and understanding, hey, it's natural for me to have sexual feelings, to have sexual desires, to want to act on those. It doesn't mean I'm a bad person. It doesn't mean I'm broken. And then once you let go of the shame, then you can say, now that I'm not feeling the shame about this, what is actually going to be skillful for me to do? What is leading me to a life that I love? And rather than approaching it from this, this is sinful, this is bad, I'm bad, you can say, I'm not bad, but I also recognize that this behavior is not supporting me. And it's a much stronger foundation to build your recovery off of when you can treat yourself with that compassion and kindness and say, no, I am lovable. And, this is the paradox. It's like, I am lovable. And some of the things I'm doing are not in alignment with my values, with my ethics, and I need to change them. And that's a paradox that's very hard for people to grasp, how to accept and love yourself the way you are and recognize that there's still room for improvement. It's something that you just kind of have to accept the paradox. Yes, I am lovable the way I am. and I accept myself as I am. And I know that there's room for improvement, and I can and should do better. For me, one of the reasons I do this work, I come on podcasts like this and talk about my porn addiction, is to normalize it, because I know it's what I would have needed when I was going through this. Because for me, I went through a period most of my life where even after I broke free, even after I realized I had an addiction and started doing the work, and we can talk about what that was like for me, the work that I did. Even after I broke free from porn addiction, I couldn't talk about the fact that I even watched porn, let alone had an addiction to it for 6 years. I couldn't tell a single soul because I was so ashamed of it. But I know that every time someone who's struggling with it hears a story like this and they say, wow, I'm not alone. I'm not the only one. Even that alone does so much to help the person break free. So letting go of shame is a huge part of breaking free from addiction. And one last thing I'll say is that there's healthy shame and unhealthy shame. There's a form of shame that is actually beneficial, that we can actually tap into, and it's a wholesome thing to cultivate, which is to recognize that some actions that you have might actually be unskillful or inappropriate. If we don't have any shame, then there's nothing to protect us from doing harmful things either to ourselves or other people. And so we actually don't want to throw shame out completely, but we want to recognize that there's a healthy form of it that says, hey, what I'm doing is inappropriate or unskillful and I shouldn't do it. And there's the unhealthy form, which is I'm a bad person and I can't be loved and I need to, just run away, that kind of thing.
Oh my gosh, I want to go down that rabbit hole, but no, I need to pause because I want to hear your story. Like what was the catalyst for all this change? And I'd love if you could bring us back to like where you were in your life and, what resources really kind of sparked support for you, or did you have to seek it out? Like walk us through what happened. At what point did you realize like, wow, okay, something's happening here that is not helping, is not supporting me. And what did you do?
Yeah. It's interesting. I was actually listening to one of your podcast episodes with a dear friend and colleague, Lori, and her origin story is so similar to mine in many ways. Obviously, she's not a porn addict, but, for me, I was going through, I was a very high achieving type of person. I was studying genetics at UC Davis. I was setting the curve in all my classes, very motivated, tons of stellar achievements. I was captain of a sports team. I had lots of friends, lots of lovers. And I remembered everything in my life was perfect from the outside, right? I was successful. I was well-liked, physically fit. But I remember just feeling so empty inside. Everything that I achieved, it was never good enough. I would set that mark and then, oh, that wasn't good enough. I need to be better. And nothing ever felt satisfying. And I never felt good enough inside. And this was actually, it was related to the porn addiction. There was this one day where I remember walking down the street. This was in Davis, California. And it was a beautiful sunny day. The weather was perfect. And, I was having a nice day. And I remember walking down the street and seeing these two girls walking in front of me. And I remember I couldn't help but stare at the butts of the girls in front of me. I was just so filled with lust and desire and just craving. And I remember in this moment, it felt like this big black hole was opening up inside of me where I just felt empty. And I felt like the only way I could be happy is if I had those two girls or one of them or whatever. It's just this feeling of I need that. And if I don't have it, I can't be happy. And it was that moment where it was almost an existential crisis where I recognized that my life is always going to be like this. I'm always going to be filled with this feeling of nothing is good enough and I don't have enough. And in that moment, I also recognized that the feeling of lust itself was a very painful experience. And I'm not talking about attraction or desire. Those can actually be beautiful experiences. But the feeling of lust or craving is that feeling of, unless I have this thing, I can't be happy. And in that moment, what's going on is your attention you're getting complete tunnel vision, where you're ignoring all of the beautiful things going on around you, the sound of the birds, your friendships, the fact that you have food and shelter. You're ignoring all of that. And you're saying, no, my happiness is in having sex with that person. And it's such a limited way of living, and it's so constrained and such a poor way to live mentally and emotionally and spiritually. And in that moment, I realized that if I don't make a change, that I'm going to end up as this perverted old, like 70-year-old man who's trying to pick up college girls at bars. And that was a moment that really changed everything, because it made me realize like the path that I'm on is not a path leading me towards happiness. And that is when I started looking into the topic of happiness and fulfillment. And I really just went to the bookstore. I was like, what does happiness even mean? What does it mean to be happy? Is it possible? And through a few different books, I ended up picking up this book called Happiness by Mathieu Ricard. And that book totally transformed my life. You know, it felt like a 180-degree shift. And what was so powerful about that book was two really important things. One is he really looked at the topic of what is happiness. And I had always thought, well, if I can just have more pleasure and more validation and more success, then I'll be happy. But what that book really showed is happiness is much more about how you're relating to what's present in your life, and that it's an internal thing. It's a way of relating to your life rather than what you actually have in your life. And so things like contentment and appreciation and compassion and equanimity, these are all things that actually lead directly to happiness. The other important thing about this book is that it really started to explore the topic of neuroplasticity. And that I remember this one quote that was so powerful. It was that neurons that fire together wire together. And I remember in that moment realizing that I was hardwiring lust and craving and feeling like I didn't have enough into my mind every time I looked at porn. I was hardwiring the neural circuitry of objectifying women and sexualizing women. And I was the source of my own suffering. Like I was creating the conditions of my unhappiness by hardwiring in these neural pathways. So that book really changed everything for me.
Oh my gosh. I mean, there is so much here, so much here. And I really appreciate you sharing that very raw and real story. And it's just so crazy to be like sitting here virtually across from you, hearing you describe what you went through. And so much of what you're saying, especially this line, unless I have this thing, I cannot be happy. I so deeply relate to that way of thinking, something that I'm still working through. And I know so many listeners resonate with that. And it's just so crazy to just observe how it shows up in people's lives in all these different ways. I mean, it's just wild because I feel like that's just such a common thought pattern, such a common thought pattern.
Yeah. And this is where it connects with Buddhism, which is so beautiful, is this is the essence of Buddhist philosophy, which is that suffering is present in our lives in many different ways. And that cause of suffering is craving. And what craving is that thought, I need this. And if I don't have it, I can't be happy. That's what craving is. And it doesn't matter whether it's craving for a slice of pizza or craving for porn or craving for validation from lovers. Anything that we kind of lock into this mind space of thinking, I need to have that. And if I don't have it, I can't be happy. That's where suffering comes from. And the flip side as well, aversion is just the flip side of that, which is this thing needs to be gone. And if it's not gone, I can't be happy. This pain, this unpleasant feeling, this whatever it is that I don't like, unless it's gone, I can't be happy. And those two, craving and aversion, that's where suffering comes from. And we create it for ourselves, right? It's everywhere, social media. We're all craving like, I want more followers, or, I want more this, I want more that. And the ways that we get attached to those things, we're grabbing onto it. Like, I need that.
I promise to the listeners, we will get back to what happened next. But I do want to actually hone in on something, which is this concept of craving and craving being bad. So, or I guess I don't want to call it bad. It's not just like so simplified that it's either good or bad, but it is at the root of a lot of suffering, as you just described. I'm curious, I'm looking at you. You are a accomplished, seemingly content as you stand, sit across from me right now, virtually, human being. How do you balance that notion of striving or trying to get somewhere else, even if it's climbing out of addiction, or trying to launch a company and, you have this dream for the career that you want or the relationship that you want. How do you balance that with like not craving necessarily or not getting kind of tied into the craving? Because and maybe I'm very mistaken in this, but I'm familiar with some Buddhist philosophies. I think a lot of the listeners are as well, since we talk about these topics on this podcast. But there's like this fear, almost like a fear that I have that craving is what drives me, right? And then what happens when you let go of that, right? I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I'm glad you went down this little tangent. It's so important to understand there is a big difference between desire and craving. And desire, there's actually many more healthy and wholesome and skillful desires, and those should be celebrated. So, for example, the desire to end world suffering, the desire to end world hunger, the desire to be free from addiction, the desire to be a source of safety for other people. Those are beautiful things and we should celebrate them. And we should, the other big misconception in the spiritual world is effort. People give effort like, you shouldn't effort. You should just let things flow, right? Just let things be, let things flow. And there's a time to let things be and let things flow and surrender. But effort is actually also really beautiful and wholesome and skillful, like putting in effort to move in the right direction, putting in effort to train the mind, to cultivate wholesome qualities. So desire is a beautiful thing. When it becomes craving is when it has that kind of tunnel vision quality to it. It really is like a thought in the mind. It's a subconscious thought usually, but it's almost always some flavor of, unless I have this thing, I can't be happy. So having a desire to build a company, it's beautiful. It's like, no, I want to build a company because I want to be financially free so that I don't have to stress about that, so that I can be a better partner or daughter or brother and show up in the way that I want to. That's beautiful. When it's craving, it's like, I need more money. I need it. I need followers. I need pleasure. That's craving. And you can feel, this is where mindfulness really comes into play, is learning how to feel into the difference between desire and craving. Craving feels constricted. It feels limiting, So yeah, I'm really glad you asked this because there's a huge difference between desire and craving, and desires are beautiful.
That's really powerful. And it just speaks to the power of cultivating the mindfulness to recognize the difference. So tell us, you have this existential crisis walking down the street, it sounds like. What happened next? I know you read the book on happiness, you started to investigate, but there's still so much between, exploring a way out and actually getting to the other side and then being in a place where you can speak about it. What was the process like, and what was it like, even quote, coming out into the world and speaking about this experience? I mean, that just can be really horrifying, I think, for a lot of people who are going through something like addiction in any shape.
Yeah, that's a big 10 to 12 year chunk of my life. So I'll do my best to give you the important parts.
Just summarize, the cliff notes of your life, just throw it in there.
Yeah.
What were some of the big tools that were supportive, and, where did you go for support? I think that's also key, right?
Well, part of the reason I do the work I do today is I didn't have the support that I needed. And so my recovery took longer and was more circuitous. But I recognize now you can recover alone. It's just a very difficult journey. And it's so easy to fall off the wagon and just fall back into old habits and behaviors. And it's one of the reasons that in the coaching work I do, having accountability, having coaching, I also run some group programs, but having that support and accountability is such a critical part of recovery. But aside from that, what I did is, after reading some of these books, and the thing that was so vital to me was realizing how important the mind is, and that you can do all the things externally. You could stop watching porn, but if you don't really cultivate the mind, if you don't train the mind, you might be able to stop one addiction, but it'll just switch over to a new one. Okay, so one of the most beautiful studies that really illustrates something important is what's called the rat park experiment. Have you heard of the rat park experiment? No.
No, I haven't.
Yeah. So it was this study when they were studying drugs and addiction. I forget what decade it was, maybe like 30 years ago or something. And they looked at the effect of, I think it was morphine laced water. And so they put they put morphine in water and gave it to rats in cages. And these rats would sit there and drink the morphine water until they died. So they really showed how addictive it was, right? But then this one researcher had this question. He said, well, they're in these horrible cages. It's not really a nice environment. Like, what if we gave them a happy environment to live in where they had running wheels and other rats to play with, and it was actually a nicer place to live? And when they did that, they found that the rats barely touched the morphine water, that they would drink a little bit, but then they would go play and have sex and run on the wheels. And what it really illustrates is that addiction is never really about the substance. It's about what's going on in your life that's causing you to reach out for distraction or, wanting to escape. And that if you want to break free from addiction, what you need to do is cultivate a life that doesn't need addiction in the first place. And it's profound because it's like so many people think, oh, okay, let me just grit my teeth and stop watching porn. And it's like, it doesn't work that way. If you're not connecting with what fulfills you, if you're not connecting with community, if you're not, living a life of purpose or meaning or building your life into a more beautiful life, then you're just going to get addicted to something else, right? Because there's that hole inside of you that you're trying to fill.
Wow. I feel like I need to repeat that statement. Cultivate a life that you're not running away from. I mean, I don't even think, I think I butchered that completely, but that is just such a powerful statement. And it begs the question though, right? When I think about that, like cultivating that dream life, and I think about the people around me who perhaps struggle to identify that for themselves and then get there.
Mm-hmm.
Very frequently, there are a lot of fears standing between where you are and where you want to be, right? So to cultivate that life, I guess the question is, the addiction, it stems from, I guess, in a way, like running away from something or living in misalignment. It's not about the addictive substance itself. But is it the fears that kind of feed the addiction, or is it the misalignment? Do you know what I'm saying? Where I'll give you a concrete example. You're somebody who really wants a particular, different kind of lifestyle in terms of job, balance, partnership, all of that. But you have all these fears around, let's say, not being worthy enough or putting yourself out there to take an interview where you might be rejected. So every single time, you want to create that life of alignment, but you have all of these crazy fears and kind of blocks standing between you and where you want to be. And so that it's such a powerful statement, but I almost ask for people out there who in any way are addicted to something, or maybe not addicted, but suffering right now because they're living in misalignment, that path to getting there. Like what, maybe that's Buddhism in between to help you get there. Do you see what I'm saying? Where it almost feels like, that statement is so powerful, but if you're in the midst of kind of escaping because you're not in alignment, what do you do? Right?
Yeah. And it's like the chicken or the egg, or like, how do you even get started? Like if you feel like you're unlovable, how do you even start believing, that it's possible?
Yeah. Exactly.
And in some ways it's related to some of the things that I've learned in Buddhist philosophy. In Buddhism, the main path of freedom is called the Eightfold Path. And what I really like about it is that there's not really a starting point. It's not like you first go to step 1 and then there's step 2. It's like you need all 8 path factors, and you kind of land anywhere on it, and they all influence and feed into each other, but you need all of them. And in the same way, it's like in recovery, when you're breaking free from addiction, you need all these different things. And one of them is, genuine self-love and self-compassion, learning how, and that's what's beautiful is that that's a skill you can cultivate. This is what we teach in emotional intelligence seminars and mindfulness workshops, is you can cultivate these qualities. This is what meditation is. It's different ways to train the mind to cultivate qualities. And cultivating genuine self-compassion for yourself, or cultivating genuine love and kindness and saying, I care about myself. I care about my well-being. And may I take care of myself. Those are things that you can strengthen and cultivate, and you need to cultivate those. And at the same time, you also need to do the work of stopping, the behavior that's unskillful and being disciplined. Sometimes those almost feel like opposite, like discipline and effort and, consistency. Sometimes it feels like it's not self-compassionate, but it is. It's like they all feed into each other. And this is where having accountability and support is so important, is that so many people don't believe it's possible for themselves. They think, I see other people recovering from this, but for me, it's just not possible. I've just been too addicted for too long. And having the reminder from support, from a community, from a coach or a mentor saying, no, like you can do this. And here's how. That belief is really important. If somebody doesn't want to change or doesn't believe they can change, it's very hard to get started.
Jeremy, I truly could just keep talking to you for hours. I mean, we covered like a third of what I had on my list. But I love that you really speak to A, the possibility for people, B, you're leading by example because you're somebody who has gotten through what is a very difficult kind of hurdle in your life to be on the other side and speaking about it. And I also really am grateful that you mentioned the importance of that social community support, the support of a coach, of other people who have gone through it. Because I feel like in our society today, we're so disconnected from that. And being part of community is a key part of wellness. Like, I think there should be a category for wellness known as social wellness. Frankly, we don't talk about that. We talk about vitamins, food, sleep, meditation. But what about the people in your life and how that environment really influences you? I'm just so glad that you brought it up.
Yeah. There's a story that I really love from the Buddhist tradition where, the Buddha had all these followers, and one of his main disciples or whatever, I don't even like the word disciple, it feels too religious, but one of his right-hand man was named Ananda. And one day Ananda went to the Buddha and said, I think I've had this great insight that the Sangha is a word for spiritual community. He said, Sangha must be like a full half of the spiritual life. And the Buddha looked at him and he said, no, Ananda, the Sangha is the whole of the spiritual life. Really, it's all about, community. And one way of looking at that, it's like, you can say it's a nice poetic quote, but if you look at it, it's really about how are we relating to each other. It's about how we're showing up in the world for ourselves and for other people. And having that community, having that support, and living in harmony with yourself and other people is really what it's all about. There's no point in being a good meditator if you're not applying it to your relationships.
That is so powerful. Oh my gosh. Okay, I lied. I have one more question. I have to throw this in there. So,
Sure.
We talked about how, addictions in a way enable us to escape the parts of reality that we are not aligned with. There's that kind of element of getting that dopamine hit, moving away from what is causing us suffering. You're somebody who works online, right? At least part of your business is online. You are out there publicly speaking, talking to me, running your business online, I assume. And it's almost as though we're kind of being sucked into this world that is disconnected from the real world in a way, right? And of course, there's something to be said for the fact that you and I can even have this conversation. We're using beautiful technology. Shout out to Zencaster, and, connected off on over email and on LinkedIn. But I'm curious, how do you skillfully leverage technology in your everyday life? Because you have followers, you have people who praise you, who connect with you, I would love to hear from example from you. Like, what are some things that you do to kind of keep it from crossing the line, from becoming too disconnected, let's say, in what isn't the real world ultimately?
It's a great question. So I have an online course that's called Unhooked, and it's about breaking free from digital addictions. And I call it Unhooked, not disconnected, because we can't really be disconnected in the society we live in. Like, most people can't go and live off the grid in a forest, right? So this is the reality that we're living in. But the question is, how are we engaging with it when we are connected online? Are we getting hooked by these things? And that's again that looking at the craving. Like, are we craving to have more followers? Are we craving to get validation? And what are the ways that we're showing up, and what are the intentions that we have? The other thing that's really important is living, kind of having a philosophy of digital use. So many people think if there's any benefit to some new app, then I'll take it on. But I love this work by Cal Newport, who wrote a book called Digital Minimalism. And he talks about, instead, you should have a philosophy and say, do the pros of this new technology outweigh the cons? Most people don't think about that. They don't look at what is this taking away from my life? How much time is it taking? How much energy is it taking? What are the emotional effects of this app? And so having that awareness and then being firm and disciplined with yourself. A big part is FOMO. So many of us have this fear of missing out, right? We're like, if I'm not on Instagram or if I'm not on this, then I'll be missing out. And realize that, I don't know if you know JOMO, but it's the joy of missing out. And it's like to really, to tap into that. It's like when you see the effects that it has on people, and you see the ways that people can get so wrapped up in some of these technologies to the point that it causes serious mental health effects, depression, anxiety, addiction, and say, I don't want to take part in that. I want to go against the stream, and I want to live in a different way. And it's not easy. I think there's another book I would recommend for your followers if they're interested in this. It's called Irresistible by Adam Alter. And it's all about how the technology companies, billions and billions of dollars go into engineering these apps to be as addictive as possible. And this, again, go back to the self-compassion. It's not your fault if you're addicted. It's like you're fighting against billions and billions of dollars of engineering and advertising. So to recognize when you do want to make a change, to get the support that you need, to find a coach, to find a therapist, to find a support group, and to read on some of these books. There's so much out there that you can do, but you have to make that first step.
I know a lot of listeners are going to be making a first step in finding you. So please tell us, how can people find you? And please share with this community any kind of exciting offerings that you might have coming up, if there's anything you want to speak to.
Yeah. So, I am on a lot of the social medias. So Instagram, Jeremy Lipkowitz. I have a website. Definitely one-on-one coaching if that's something that you're interested in. I also just started a group coaching program for men who are dealing with porn addiction or just a compulsive use of porn and want to cultivate a healthier relationship to it. So if you're interested in that, you can find more information. Just send me a message online or look at my website.
And everything will, of course, be linked in the show notes. Jeremy, it was such a pleasure having you on. Thank you so much for joining us.
It was a joy to be here. I'm looking forward to next time.
Yeah. Thank you to everyone who tuned in. And I have so many takeaways that I'm going to be walking away with. Have an incredible week, everyone. Thank you. Hello, incredible humans. Thank you so much for tuning into this episode of Nourish. If you enjoyed this conversation, please consider leaving a review or sharing it with a friend. Reviews really help this podcast grow and reach a larger audience, and I'm so grateful for that. I publish new episodes twice a month, so hit the subscribe button to be notified. And if you'd like to learn more about the work I do as a holistic life coach or to connect, please check out the show notes or find me on Instagram at Mira_wellness_co. See you next time.